Welcome back to part 2 of our little video series on evidence for the resurrection. Last week we thought about, before we think about the resurrection, we had to think about whether Jesus actually died in the first place. And so we looked at our first E, which was the execution and burial. And so today we're going to be thinking about the empty tomb and the eyewitnesses. Alright? Have you ever heard the phrase, "I won't believe it until I see it"? Yeah? Something is said to you, something is shown you that is so crazy, so wild, so out of the ordinary that you say, well, I'm not going to believe that until I see it. Now, I was going to give you the example of the lamb banana that is in Liverpool. I used to use that illustration in Oxford because it's far further away, but because you're in North Wales, you've probably all seen the lamb banana in Liverpool. So let me ask you this, have you seen the water skiing elephant? Yeah, an elephant water skiing. Here is a photograph of the elephant water skiing. The elephant's name is Queenie. It's an Asian elephant water skiing on the Hudson River for entertainment in the 1950s. Don't believe it until you see it. Well, there you go. Now, of course, when it comes to someone rising from the dead, you're going to want to know it's definitely true. You're going to want to know that it really happened, and so you're going to want to be able to see it for yourself. Because someone coming back from the dead doesn't happen every day. So the Bible tells us that Jesus was buried in the tomb. We thought about that last time in our last video. But then on the Sunday morning, the Bible tells us that the tomb was empty. And as we'll see today, there's no disputing the tomb was empty. The issue is what happened to the body. Was Jesus really alive, or was his body moved? Everyone who was there, they saw the empty tomb, but they didn't believe until they saw Jesus, and it is him that they saw. Now, there are a few theories about what could have happened. We've thought about the swoon theory already, the fact that Jesus was buried, but he revived. We've already dismissed that. Now, before we think about evidence for the empty tomb, we've got to first prove that the tomb was full. And we thought about the burial earlier on, but let's think a bit more about that. Now, often in Christianity, we don't focus a lot on the burial of Jesus. We rightly focus on his death and his resurrection, but the fact that he was buried is quite key and quite important, of course. And when you read through all the gospel accounts, you read of his burial. We hear about a man called Joseph, don't we, from Arimathea. Matthew tells us he was wealthy. Mark tells us he was part of the Jewish ruling council. John tells us that even though he was the ruling council, he didn't approve of the crucifixion. In fact, Joseph was a secret disciple of Jesus. When you then read of him, he takes down the body from the cross, wraps it in linen cloth. That's important for later on. And then they bury him. They bury him in his own tomb. John tells us that the tomb was nearby the cross in the garden. Luke tells us that Mary Magdalene and another Mary followed Joseph, and they saw where he buried the body, and they watched him bury Jesus. And then, of course, finally, the stone is rolled in front of the tomb. Jesus is buried. Now, so first theory that counters the empty tomb is that these women who then went to the tomb on Sunday morning, well, they went to the wrong tomb. But even though they saw where Jesus was buried, the theory is that they were too distressed and confused to know where the right tomb was. But if this was so, then Joseph, the man who owned the tomb, or others could have pointed out where the right tomb was. And of course, this is just wild speculation based on no evidence that they went to the wrong tomb. And the fact is that Jesus' own enemies, they knew where he was buried, and they could have pointed out the right tomb to put an end to all of the claims of resurrection. Now, I think this is quite a key piece of evidence for the resurrection. You see, because as I said earlier, no one disputes the fact the tomb was empty, not even the soldiers or the religious leaders. The point is, what happened to the body? And that leads us on to our second theory, and that is that the tomb was empty because the disciples stole the body. Matthew records to us in Matthew 27 verse 62. The next day, the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell people that he had been raised from the dead. The last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. It was because they feared that the disciples might steal the body that they sealed the entrance to the tomb and put a guard, a group of soldiers there watching it. Now, would the disciples have stolen the body? Could they have stolen the body? For them to do it, they first would have had to pick themselves up after the dejection and the sorrow of losing their leader, their saviour. Jesus predicted that he would rise again. The religious leaders had remembered that, but these disciples, that didn't even come into their mind. Even at the time when Jesus predicted his resurrection, the disciples didn't understand it. They would talk and discuss about what it meant. And we can read that in Mark chapter 9, for example, verse 10. Well, secondly, if the soldiers were to steal the body, then the disciples, to steal the body, they would have to confront the soldiers. Now, remember, in Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples all ran away in fear of the soldiers. Thirdly, they would have had to have overcome and overpowered the Roman soldiers, and that's not going to happen. Okay, remember, a guard is not just one. A guard is the name of a group of soldiers that were sealing and guarding the tomb. As we'll see later on, the other truth is that the lives of these disciples were so radically turned upside down and transformed with great power. They went and proclaimed Christ. They gave their lives literally defending what they believed. Now, why would they do that for something that they knew wasn't true? Well, the final theory of the empty tomb is that the Jewish authorities moved the tomb, moved the body. But again, why would they do that? If they want to disprove the resurrection, all they need to do is to reveal the body. But they couldn't. They couldn't produce the dead body of Jesus because, well, they couldn't find it. They didn't have it. However, the religious leaders and the soldiers, they concocted a story, therefore, to defend the fact that they believed the disciples stole the body. So Matthew chapter 28, verse 11, we read this. Some of the guards, that's those who were at the tomb, went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. What had happened? Well, we read back in verse 2, we see what it is that happened earlier on. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him, they shook and became like dead men. It's only when they come to that they went to the chief priests. Okay, so fast forward to verse 12. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, that is Jesus, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were sleeping. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews until this day. So when it's all said and done, an American historian, Paul Mayer, has said this: if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was actually empty on the morning of the first Easter. And no shred of evidence has yet been discovered in literary sources, epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions, or archaeology that would disprove this statement. And then last of all, if the disciples did steal the body, why did they go to the effort of folding up the grave clothes and laying them where he lay? So the tomb is empty, but where's the body? That leads us to thinking about the eyewitnesses, those who saw the body alive and well, Jesus alive and well. And 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul lays out to us a series of several different people who saw Jesus alive. Many of them were still alive when Paul wrote his letter and so could verify it or disprove it if it wasn't right. Let me read those verses to you. This is 1 Corinthians 15 from verse 3. He says, "For what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." That means they've died. "Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also as one abnormally born." Okay, we'll think about this list in a moment, but who is missing? The women. Wasn't it the women who first discovered the body, the empty tomb, and even saw Jesus on that first day? And the Gospels tell us that Mary Magdalene, the mother of James, the women, they were there at the tomb first of all. Listen to Mark's account of the women's experience. "When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they bought spices so they might go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, 'Who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb?' But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. 'Don't be alarmed,' he said. 'You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you.' Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." All the Gospels write and record that the women were the first witnesses of the tomb, empty tomb. And that's interesting because in that culture, in those days, the testimony of a woman would have been dismissed completely. William Lane Craig, who is an expert in defending the resurrection, he says this: A woman's testimony was regarded as so worthless that they weren't even allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. In light of this, it's absolutely remarkable that the chief witnesses to the empty tomb are these women. Any later legendary account would have certainly betrayed male disciples as discovering the tomb. Peter or John, for example. The fact that the women are the first witnesses to the empty tomb is most plausibly explained by the reality that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb. So, if the Gospels were stories made up later on, as some claim, you wouldn't put women as the first witnesses of the tomb, it would have been men. So, as Paul tells us, after the women, Jesus appeared to Peter. Now, Peter didn't believe the women when they first told him. He ran to the tomb to see it empty for himself. And then later on, he sees Jesus, who appeared to him. But was it Jesus who appeared to him and the other disciples in the room? Well, after that occasion, Thomas, a disciple who wasn't there, said, well, I'm not going to believe it until I see the marks in his hands and put my hand in the side. I will not believe it. And, fair enough. And so a week later, in John chapter 20, we read, Jesus appeared and said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hand. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas replied, my Lord and my God. And he believed it to be true. So the disciples claim to have seen Jesus, but this is just a small group of people. Could they not have just invented the story? Well, Paul goes on to tell us next that Jesus appeared to 500 people at the same time. That's a lot of people. Some people tell us, or some people have a theory that these eyewitness accounts were just a hallucination. But again, that's unlikely, because a hallucination, by definition, is something personal and something internal. It's impossible for 500 people to all hallucinate the same thing at the same time. So the disciples didn't hallucinate, they really saw Jesus. Well, after the 500, then we get Paul himself, Saul of Tarsus, the infamous murderer, persecutor of Christians. Paul was the last person you would expect to become a Christian. And in Acts chapter 8, we see he's met by the risen Jesus himself on the road to Damascus, and his life is transformed. He doesn't murder Christians, but he commits his life to making Christians. So here we have the eyewitness accounts, and they cannot be refuted. And as we'll see in our next video, the radical transformation of the lives of the disciples is a great testimony to the fact that this is true and not made up a story.